Have you noticed something strange happening around you? The people who seem most alive, most conscious, most awake to what's really going on, they're quietly stepping back. They're disappearing from the noise, from the endless social performances, from the rat race that everyone else seems so desperately committed to. And I'm not talking about dropping out in some dramatic way. I'm talking about a quiet, almost invisible withdrawal, a fading into the background while everyone else fights to be seen. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and I keep coming back to the wisdom of Alan Watts, because Watts understood something that most people spend their entire lives missing. He understood that awakening, true spiritual awakening, doesn't make you more compatible with society. It makes you less compatible. And that's not a bug. That's a feature. Let me ask you something. Have you ever woken up from a dream and felt that strange disorientation? That moment where the dream world felt so real just seconds ago, and now you're lying in bed wondering how you ever believed in it? Now imagine waking up from the dream that most people call normal life. Imagine suddenly seeing through the games, the performances, the endless accumulation of things that don't matter. That's what spiritual awakening does, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Watts talked about this constantly. He said, "We live in a world where we've confused the menu with the meal. We're so busy reading about life, talking about life, performing life, that we've forgotten to actually live. And the people who wake up to this, they can't keep playing along. It becomes physically, emotionally, spiritually exhausting to keep pretending that the menu is satisfying their hunger. So they start to disappear. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, quietly, they begin to extract themselves from the machinery of modern society. And I want to explore why this is happening, because I think it's one of the most important patterns of our time. And if you felt this pull yourself, if you felt this strange desire to step back from everything that society tells you matters, then what I'm about to share might help you understand why. Let me start with what I mean by spiritually awake. I'm not talking about people who think they're better than everyone else. I'm not talking about some elite club of enlightened beings floating above the rest of humanity. That's actually the opposite of what I mean. True awakening, as Watts understood it, is the dissolution of that very sense of separation. It's the recognition that the whole game of being superior or inferior, better or worse, awakened or asleep, it's just another story the mind tells itself. But here's what does happen. When someone goes through a genuine spiritual awakening, their relationship to reality fundamentally shifts. The things that used to matter stop mattering. The things they used to chase lose their appeal. The performances they used to give become unbearable. It's like they've been upgraded to a new operating system, but everyone else is still running the old software, and the two systems just don't communicate very well anymore. Watts had this beautiful way of describing it. He'd say that the awakened person looks insane to the sleeping world, and the sleeping world looks insane to the awakened person. But neither is insane. They're just operating from completely different paradigms, different assumptions about what's real, what matters, what life is actually for. And this creates a problem, because we live in a society that runs on very specific assumptions. It assumes that more is better. It assumes that success means accumulation. It assumes that your value is determined by your productivity, your status, your achievements. It assumes that image matters more than substance. It assumes that the future is more important than the present moment. It assumes that happiness is something you achieve rather than something you are. When you wake up, really wake up, these assumptions fall apart. You start to see them for what they are. Stories, collective agreements, shared hallucinations that keep the machinery of society running smoothly. And once you see through them, participating in them becomes incredibly difficult. Let me give you an example. Social media. For most people, social media is just a normal part of life. You post, you scroll, you compare, you perform, you craft your image, you seek validation, you participate in the endless game of attention and approval. For someone who's spiritually awake, this becomes almost unbearable to watch, let alone participate in. They see the desperation behind every post. They see people curating highlight reels of lives they're not actually living. They see the anxiety, the comparison, the constant need for external validation. They see how much time and energy is being poured into maintaining an image for people who are also just maintaining images. It's images looking at images. Performances watching performances. And nobody's actually home. Watts would call this the confusion between the symbol and the reality. We've become so obsessed with the symbols of a good life, the images of happiness, success, connection, that we've forgotten what the actual experience of those things feels like. We're taking pictures of our food instead of tasting it. We're announcing our experiences instead of having them. We're building brands instead of being human. And the person who wakes up to this, they can't keep doing it. It's like asking someone who's tasted real food to get excited about plastic fruit. They just can't. The fakeness of it becomes too obvious. The emptiness of it becomes too painful. So they start to step back. They post less. They scroll less. Eventually they disappear from those platforms altogether. Not because they think they're too good for it, but because it's simply incompatible with the reality they're now living in. But it goes deeper than social media. It extends to almost every aspect of conventional social life. Small talk becomes difficult, not because awakened people are antisocial, but because they can't engage in conversations that avoid what's real. When someone asks them how they're doing, they actually feel what they're feeling. They can't just automatically say fine and move on. When conversations stay on the surface, discussing weather and traffic and celebrity gossip, they feel a kind of claustrophobia, a desperate need for something real, something true, something that acknowledges the depth and mystery of being alive. Watts talked about this too. He said that most conversation is just noise, people talking to avoid silence, talking to fill space, talking to maintain the illusion that we're separate individuals who need to constantly remind each other that we exist. Real communication, he said, happens in the silence between words, in the space where two consciousnesses recognize each other without the need for all the verbal decoration. But try having that kind of communication at a cocktail party. Try bringing that kind of presence to a networking event. You become the weird one, the intense one, the person who makes others uncomfortable because you're actually present while they're running their social scripts. So the awakened person starts declining invitations. They stop going to events that drain their energy. They stop engaging in conversations that feel empty. They stop participating in social rituals that no longer resonate. And from the outside, this looks like withdrawal. It looks like they're becoming antisocial, depressed, or judgmental. But that's not what's happening at all. What's happening is a fundamental reorganization of priorities, because awakening brings with it a visceral understanding of something that most people only understand intellectually, that life is short, that time is the most precious resource we have, that every moment spent doing something that doesn't resonate is a moment of life you'll never get back. Watts put it beautifully. He said, "We're so busy preparing to live that we forget to actually live. We spend our youth getting educated so we can spend our middle age working so we can spend our old age relaxing, and by then we're too tired and sick to enjoy it. We're always living for some future moment when things will finally be okay, when we'll finally be enough, when we'll finally be able to rest. But that moment never comes, because we're always postponing it. The awakened person sees through this trap. They realize that life is not a rehearsal. This is it. This moment, right now, is the only moment that actually exists. And when you really get that, when you really embody that understanding, you stop wasting time. You stop saying yes to things you mean no to. You stop going to events out of obligation. You stop maintaining relationships that feel false. You stop working jobs that crush your soul just to buy things you don't need to impress people you don't like. This is what's really happening when spiritually awake people disappear from society. They're not running away. They're running toward authenticity, toward presence, toward lives that actually reflect what they value rather than what they're supposed to value. And this brings me to one of the most painful aspects of awakening, the loneliness. Because when you see the world differently, when you operate from different values, when you can't participate in the games anymore, you become isolated. Not by choice, but by incompatibility. I want to be really honest about this. Awakening can be incredibly lonely. You want to share what you're seeing. You want to communicate this sense of freedom and aliveness and presence that you've discovered. But most people aren't interested. They're too invested in their own stories, their own dramas, their own pursuits. And when you try to point towards something different, you're often met with defensiveness or dismissal. Watts experienced this himself. He talked about how the sage is always considered strange by conventional society, how the person who's actually free looks insane to people who are imprisoned but don't know it. He used to say that we live in an asylum where the inmates have taken over, and anyone who's actually sane is labelled as crazy. This creates a real dilemma for awakened people. Do they keep trying to communicate what they see, knowing it will often fall on deaf ears? Do they stay engaged with people who aren't interested in depth, authenticity, or truth? Or do they withdraw into spaces where they can actually breathe? Most choose the latter, not out of superiority or judgment, but out of self-preservation. Because there's something you need to understand about awakening. It makes you sensitive. Not sensitive as in easily offended, but sensitive as in you feel things more deeply. You pick up on energy more readily. You can sense the difference between presence and performance, between authenticity and facade, between love and fear. And when you're that sensitive, spending time in environments that are dominated by fear, performance, and superficiality becomes physically draining. It's like being a raw nerve in a room full of people banging drums. You need to protect yourself. You need to guard your energy. You need to create space where you can maintain the peace and clarity you've worked so hard to cultivate. This is why awakened people often become very selective about who they spend time with. It's not elitism, it's energy management. They've learned, often through painful experience, that their peace is fragile, that it can be disrupted by an hour of toxic conversation, that it can be shattered by exposure to environments that run on anxiety, competition, and drama. Watts understood this deeply. He talked about how the awakened person has to be careful not to get pulled back into the dream. How easy it is to get reabsorbed into the collective trance if you're not vigilant. He said that consciousness is like a candle flame. It needs protection from the wind. You have to create conditions where it can stay lit. So the awakened person starts creating those conditions. They simplify their life. They reduce their commitments. They spend more time alone or with the few people who really get it. They move to quieter places. They leave careers that demand they compromise their integrity. They stop trying to fit into a world that was never designed for people who are actually awake. And here's where it gets really interesting, because from the outside, this looks like failure. It looks like they're dropping out, giving up, not living up to their potential. Society has very clear markers of success: money, status, influence, achievement. And the awakened person is often moving in the opposite direction, making less money, caring less about status, reducing their influence, letting go of achievement for achievement's sake. But from the inside, this is liberation. This is finally living in alignment with what's real rather than what's expected. This is choosing being over doing, presence over performance, depth over breadth, quality over quantity. Watts had a perfect metaphor for this. He talked about how we're taught to play the game of black and white, the game of winning and losing, success and failure, good and bad. But the awakened person stops playing that game altogether. They're not trying to win anymore. They're not trying to be the best version of themselves because they've realized there's no version to improve. They're just being what they are, as they are, without apology or enhancement. This is why awakened people often seem to care less about things that drive everyone else. They're not ambitious in the conventional sense. They're not hustling. They're not grinding. They're not trying to maximize anything. They're just living. Actually living. Being present for the miracle of existence instead of constantly trying to manipulate existence into giving them what they think they need. And this is profoundly threatening to a society that runs on ambition, competition, and acquisition. Because if everyone realized they could just stop playing the game, the whole structure would collapse. The economy depends on people wanting more than they have. The social hierarchy depends on people caring about status. The entire machine depends on people being dissatisfied, anxious, and constantly reaching for the next thing. The awakened person has stopped reaching. They've arrived, not because they've achieved some spiritual summit, but because they've realized there's nowhere to go. They're already here. This is it. And it's enough. It's more than enough. It's miraculous. Can you imagine how disruptive this is to a culture of endless consumption and comparison? Someone who's genuinely content, who doesn't need the next thing, who isn't trying to impress anyone, who isn't playing the status game, they're essentially opting out of the entire economic and social system. They're not a good consumer. They're not a good worker bee. They're not a good participant in the collective trance. So society doesn't know what to do with them. It can't reward them because they don't want the rewards. It can't threaten them because they're not afraid of losing status. It can't motivate them with the usual carrots and sticks. They've become ungovernable, not through rebellion, but through indifference to the things that govern everyone else. This is what Watts meant when he talked about the watercourse way, the way of least resistance, the way of flowing like water, which doesn't push or strive or force, but simply follows its nature. The awakened person has stopped pushing against life. They've stopped trying to force reality to conform to their preferences. They've surrendered to what is, and in that surrender, found a freedom that no amount of achievement could ever provide. But let me be clear about something. This surrender isn't passive. It's not about becoming a doormat or checking out of life. The awakened person is often incredibly engaged, but their engagement comes from a different place. It comes from presence rather than anxiety, from love rather than fear, from fullness rather than emptiness. They're not disappearing because they've given up on the world. They're disappearing from the false world so they can actually participate in the real one. They're leaving the theatre so they can step into life. They're turning off the movie so they can have an actual experience. And sometimes, in that stepping back, they find others who've done the same thing. They find communities of people who are living differently, who've organized their lives around presence instead of productivity, around being instead of having, around consciousness instead of consumption. These communities don't look like conventional society. They're often invisible to the mainstream. They're gatherings in nature, quiet retreats, small intentional communities, online spaces where people can speak honestly without performance. They're the places where awakened people can finally exhale, where they don't have to explain themselves, where everyone understands the language of presence. Watts would have loved these spaces. He spent his life creating them in a way. Through his talks, his writings, his gatherings, he was constantly trying to create containers where people could wake up together, where the message of liberation could be heard without the noise of society drowning it out. Because here's the thing, the message is always the same. You are not who you think you are. You are not this isolated ego struggling through a hostile universe. You are the universe. You are the whole thing happening. You are the consciousness that witnesses everything, not the things being witnessed. And when you get this, really get this, everything changes. But you can't get this message while you're embedded in a system that constantly reinforces the opposite. A system that tells you you're separate, you're lacking, you're not enough, you need more, you need to be different, you need to achieve, acquire, accomplish. That message is so loud, so persistent, so pervasive that the message of awakening can't be heard. So the awakened person has to create distance from that noise. They have to step back far enough to remember what's true. And once they remember, once they stabilize in that remembering, going back into the noise becomes optional. They can dip in when needed, but they no longer live there. This is what the disappearance is really about. It's about claiming the right to live from truth instead of conditioning, to organize life around what's real instead of what's expected, to spend time and energy on what actually matters instead of what society says should matter. And I know what some people are thinking. This sounds like spiritual bypassing. This sounds like people using awakening as an excuse to avoid responsibility, to check out, to not contribute. And yes, that can happen. Spiritual ideas can absolutely be used to justify selfishness or avoidance, but that's not what I'm talking about. The person who's genuinely awakened doesn't become less responsible. They become more responsible, but to different things. They're not responsible to maintaining appearances anymore. They're not responsible to living up to other people's expectations. They're not responsible to perpetuating systems that create suffering, but they are deeply responsible to truth, to integrity, to treating other beings with compassion, to not causing unnecessary harm. Watts made this distinction beautifully. He said the awakened person doesn't become amoral, they become transmoral. They've gone beyond the conventional rules not because they're rebelling against them, but because they're living from something deeper, from a direct perception of interconnectedness that makes harming others feel like harming yourself. So when the awakened person withdraws from certain aspects of society, they're not abandoning responsibility. They're recalibrating what they're responsible to. They're choosing to put their energy toward what's real, what's authentic, what actually reduces suffering, rather than maintaining systems that create it. And this brings me to something really important. The awakened person's withdrawal isn't just personal, it's political. Not in the conventional sense of politics, but in the sense that it challenges the fundamental structures of how we've organized society. It says, through action rather than words, that there's another way to live, that you don't have to participate in the race, that you don't have to sacrifice your presence for productivity, that you don't have to compromise your integrity for security. This is threatening. Because as enough people realize this, if enough people opt out, the whole game changes. The power structures that depend on people's compliance, their anxiety, their need for approval, those structures lose their power. Watts saw this clearly. He understood that true revolution doesn't come from overthrowing systems. It comes from transcending them, from so thoroughly seeing through the game that you simply stop playing. And when enough people stop playing, the game ends. But I don't think we're there yet. I think we're in a transitional moment, a moment where more and more people are waking up, but the old structures are still firmly in place. And this creates tension. The awakened person feels the pull of two worlds. The world they're leaving behind, with all its familiar patterns and security, and the world they're moving toward, which is uncertain, unconventional, and often lonely. This is where a lot of awakened people get stuck. They've seen through the game, but they haven't fully committed to leaving it. They're trying to have one foot in each world, and it's tearing them apart. They go to their corporate job and feel like they're dying inside. They engage in small talk and feel like they're suffocating. They maintain relationships that have become hollow and wonder why they feel so alone. Watts would say to these people, you have to jump. You have to fully commit to the life that's calling you, even if it means uncertainty, even if it means letting go of security, even if it means disappointing people who expect you to stay the same. Because the cost of not jumping, the cost of staying in a life that's no longer true, that cost is too high. It's the cost of your aliveness, your authenticity, your soul. And I think this is where we are as a culture. More and more people are standing at that edge, feeling the call to jump, but afraid of what they'll lose. Afraid of being judged. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of not having enough. And so they hesitate. They stay in the in-between space, which is the most painful place to be. The people who are disappearing, the ones I'm talking about, they've jumped. They've decided that authenticity is worth more than security, that presence is worth more than status, that peace is worth more than approval. And yes, they've lost things. They've lost friends who couldn't understand. They've lost income from jobs they left. They've lost the comfort of fitting in. But what they've gained, you can't measure it in conventional terms. They've gained themselves. They've gained the ability to look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. They've gained mornings that don't start with dread. They've gained the freedom to spend their time on what actually matters to them. They've gained the peace that comes from living in alignment with truth. This is what Watts was pointing to his whole life. This possibility of living from a completely different center. Of being in the world, but not of it. Of participating in life without being enslaved by it. Of enjoying the play without forgetting it's a play. He used to talk about life as a game, but a game we've taken far too seriously. We've forgotten it's a game. We think the wins and losses actually matter. We think the scores are real. We think the roles we're playing are who we are. And the awakened person remembers it's just a game, and once you remember that, you can play much more freely. You can take risks. You can be creative. You can enjoy the play without being destroyed by the losses. But here's the paradox. Once you know it's a game, playing the conventional game stops being fun. Because that game requires you to believe the scores matter. It requires you to care about winning. It requires you to take it seriously. And if you can't do that anymore, if you can't pretend it's not a game, then you need to find a different game to play. Or stop playing games altogether and just be. This is the choice the awakened person faces. Keep pretending for the sake of social harmony, or honor what they know to be true and step into the uncertainty of a life organized around different principles. Most people never face this choice. They never wake up enough to realize there is a choice. They live their entire lives assuming that the way things are is the way things have to be. They never question the basic assumptions of society because those assumptions are invisible to them. They're the water the fish swims in. But the awakened person has somehow gotten out of the water. They've seen that what they thought was the entire universe is actually just one small pond. And there's a whole ocean out there. And once you've seen the ocean, living in the pond becomes impossible. So they leave, quietly, without fanfare. They don't make big announcements. They don't write manifestos. They don't try to convince everyone else to leave too. They just quietly reorganize their lives around what's true for them. They simplify, they let go, they stop trying to be something they're not. And from the outside, this can look like many things: depression, failure, dropout, waste of potential. But from the inside, it's liberation. It's finally being allowed to be human, to be present, to be real. Watts would say it's like a bird that's been caged its whole life, finally being released. At first, the bird might not even fly. It's so used to the cage, so conditioned by the bars, that freedom is terrifying. But eventually, if the bird stays free long enough, it remembers what it is. It remembers its wings. And it flies. The spiritually awake people who are disappearing, they're flying. They're remembering what they are. They're living from their essence rather than their conditioning. And yes, it takes them away from the cages where everyone else is still living. But they can't help that. Once you remember you have wings, staying in a cage becomes torture. Now, I want to address something important. I don't want this to sound like awakened people are somehow better than everyone else. That's not the point at all. In fact, that kind of thinking is antithetical to real awakening. The whole point is transcending the better than, worse than game. The awakened person doesn't look down on people who are still caught in the matrix. They remember being caught in it themselves. They have compassion for it. They understand how convincing the illusion is, how seductive the game can be, how painful it is to be driven by fear and lack and the need for more. But they also can't help them by pretending to be asleep. They can't help them by playing along with the illusion. The only way they can help is by being a living example of another possibility, by showing through their lives that peace is possible, that contentment is possible, that freedom is possible, and sometimes people notice. Sometimes someone who's still in the thick of it catches a glimpse of someone who's free, and something in them recognizes it. Something in them says, yes, that's what I've been looking for. That's what I've been missing. And in that moment, another person begins to wake up. This is how awakening spreads, not through proselytizing, not through convincing, but through presence, through example, through one person's freedom giving another person permission to seek their own freedom. Watts understood this perfectly. He never tried to convince anyone of anything. He just spoke his truth, lived his life, and trusted that the people who were ready to hear it would hear it. He knew that you can't wake someone up who wants to stay asleep, but you can be a bell that rings, and those who are ready to wake will wake to the sound. The people who are disappearing, in their own way, they're ringing bells. They're showing that there's another way. They're demonstrating through their lives that you don't have to live according to the script, that you can write your own story, that you can listen to your own truth. And I think this is becoming more and more important, because the conventional path, the path that worked for previous generations, it's not working anymore. The promise of security in exchange for compliance, it's breaking down. The idea that if you just work hard and follow the rules, you'll be okay, fewer and fewer people believe that anymore. We're in a moment of collective awakening in some ways. More people are questioning the basic assumptions of how we've organized society. More people are asking if there's another way. More people are feeling the emptiness of material success. More people are recognizing that something essential is missing from modern life. And the people who've already woken up, who've already made the jump, they're like scouts. They've gone ahead and mapped the territory. They've figured out how to live differently. They've created alternatives to the conventional path. And their disappearance from mainstream society isn't abandonment, it's exploration. They're finding the way forward. I think Watts would be fascinated by this moment. He lived in a time when the counterculture was just beginning, when people were just starting to question the post-war consensus. He saw the early stirrings of something different trying to be born. If he were alive today, I think he'd recognize that something different is still trying to be born. And it's being born through people who are brave enough to leave the known and step into the unknown. Because that's what this disappearance really is. It's a mass migration from the known to the unknown, from security to freedom, from convention to authenticity, from sleepwalking to presence. And it's not easy. I want to be really clear about that. Waking up is not easy. Living authentically is not easy. Going against the grain of society is not easy. There's loss involved. There's grief. There's confusion. There's loneliness. There are moments of doubt where you wonder if you've made a terrible mistake. But there's also something else. There's aliveness. There's the feeling of finally being in your own life instead of watching it from the outside. There's the recognition in another person's eyes when you speak truth instead of performing. There's the peace that comes from not having to maintain a false self. There's the joy that arises naturally when you're present instead of constantly planning and worrying. Watts called this the wisdom of insecurity, the recognition that real security doesn't come from controlling life, but from embracing its fundamental uncertainty, from relaxing into the flow instead of trying to dam it up, from trusting the intelligence of the universe instead of trying to outsmart it with your little ego plans. The people who are disappearing, they're living this wisdom. They've given up the illusion of security for the reality of presence. They've stopped trying to control outcomes and started showing up for the process. They've accepted that life is uncertain, unpredictable, and ultimately beyond their control, and in that acceptance found a peace that their old life of anxiety and striving could never provide. So if you're feeling the pull to step back, if you're feeling the call to disappear from the noise and drama of conventional society, know that you're not alone. Know that you're not crazy. Know that this is a legitimate response to seeing through the game. You don't have to keep playing just because everyone else is still playing. You're allowed to leave the casino. You're allowed to walk out of the theatre. You're allowed to wake up. But also know that it will cost you. It will cost you relationships with people who can't understand. It will cost you the approval of a society that wants you to stay in line. It will cost you the comfort of the familiar, the known, the secure. You'll have to become okay with being misunderstood. You'll have to make peace with being seen as strange, different, or even failed by conventional standards. The question is, what's it worth to you? What's your freedom worth? What's your authenticity worth? What's your presence worth? Only you can answer that. But I can tell you this, the people who've made that trade, who've exchanged security for authenticity, almost none of them regret it. They might miss aspects of their old life. They might grieve what they've lost, but they don't regret the trade. Because once you've tasted real freedom, once you've experienced what it's like to be fully present in your own life, you can't go back. You can't unknow what you know. You can't unsee what you've seen. The cage might be comfortable, but you remember you have wings. Watts spent his entire life trying to remind people of their wings, trying to wake them up from the trance of conventional life, trying to point them toward the freedom that's always been available but somehow forgotten. And his message is more relevant now than ever, because we're living in a time of unprecedented noise, unprecedented distraction, unprecedented pressure to conform, to perform, to produce. The machinery of modern life is more sophisticated, more all-encompassing, more inescapable than ever before. And the only way to maintain your sanity, your presence, your humanity, is to consciously step back from it. This is what the spiritually awake people understand. This is why they're disappearing. Not because they're running away, but because they're running towards something real. They're creating lives that actually reflect what humans need. Presence, connection, meaning, beauty, silence, space, time. These things aren't available in the mainstream anymore. The mainstream is too fast, too loud, too fragmented, too commercialized, too anxious. To access what's real, you have to step out. You have to create distance. You have to protect yourself from the constant assault of noise and expectation. And in that stepping out, in that creating of distance, something beautiful happens. You start to remember who you are, not who you've been told to be, not who you think you should be, but who you actually are underneath all the conditioning, all the performance, all the striving. You are not your resume. You are not your bank account. You are not your social media profile. You are not your achievements or your failures. You are not your roles, your labels, your identities. You are the awareness that witnesses all of this. You are the consciousness in which all of this appears. You are the space in which life happens. And when you remember this, when you stabilize in this recognition, everything changes. You don't need to prove yourself anymore. You don't need to improve yourself anymore. You don't need to become someone other than what you are. You can just be, just exist, just show up for the miracle of being alive. This is the ultimate disappearing act. Not disappearing from the world, but disappearing as the false self you thought you were, dissolving the ego that's been running the show, releasing the endless effort of trying to be someone and relaxing into simply being. Watts pointed to this his whole life. He called it different things. The eternal now, the wisdom of insecurity, the watercourse way, the cosmic drama. But it's all pointing to the same recognition. You are not separate from life. You are life. You are the universe experiencing itself. You are the divine play happening in this particular form. And once you get this, once you really embody this understanding, the whole game changes. You're not trying to win anymore. You're not trying to get somewhere anymore. You're not trying to become someone anymore. You're just here, fully here, completely present to what is. And from that presence, life happens through you. Not because you're making it happen, not because you're forcing it, but because you've stopped blocking it. You've removed the interference of ego, of fear, of grasping, and life flows through you naturally, spontaneously, creatively. This is what the awakened person has access to. This is what they're protecting when they withdraw from society. They're protecting this connection to the source, this access to presence, this freedom to be what they are without apology or enhancement. And maybe that's what society finds most threatening about them. Not that they're judging everyone else, but that they're free, really free. Free from the need for approval, free from the fear of loss, free from the compulsion to accumulate, free from the belief that happiness is somewhere other than here, sometime other than now. That freedom is dangerous to a system that depends on people being unfree, that depends on people being anxious, dissatisfied, always reaching for the next thing. The truly free person can't be controlled, can't be motivated by the usual carrots and sticks, can't be sold solutions to problems they don't have. So, yes, the spiritually awake people are disappearing. They're withdrawing from a system that no longer serves them. They're opting out of a game they've seen through. They're creating space to remember what's real. And maybe you're one of them. Maybe you've been feeling this pull for a while now. Maybe you've been sensing that there's another way to live. Maybe you're tired of the performance, the striving, the endless sense that you're not enough. If that's you, let me tell you something. You're not wrong. That feeling of something being off, something being missing, something being fundamentally inauthentic about modern life, that feeling is accurate. Trust it. Honor it. Let it guide you towards something truer. You don't have to dramatically quit everything and move to a cave in the mountains, although you could, but you do have to start listening to what's true for you rather than what you're supposed to want. You have to start saying no to things that drain you even if they look good on paper. You have to start protecting your energy, your time, your presence. You have to become okay with being misunderstood, with being seen as weird or lazy or not living up to your potential. Because your potential, your real potential, has nothing to do with what society thinks you should achieve. Your potential is your capacity for presence, for love, for consciousness, for being fully alive. And that potential can't be realized while you're running on the hamster wheel, while you're trying to keep up with expectations that aren't even yours, while you're sacrificing your presence for productivity, your authenticity for approval. At some point, you have to make the choice. Keep playing the game or step out of it. Keep performing or start being. Keep pursuing what you're supposed to want or turn toward what you actually want. And I'm not going to lie to you. Stepping out is scary. It's uncertain. You might lose things. People might not understand. But here's what you'll gain. You'll gain yourself. You'll gain your life back. You'll gain the freedom to actually live instead of just surviving and performing. Watts would say you'll gain what you never actually lost, because you were never actually separate from the whole. You were never actually inadequate. You were never actually alone. Those were just stories, just beliefs, just the dream you were caught in. And now you're waking up. And in waking up, you're naturally withdrawing from the dream. Not because you're rejecting anyone or anything, but because you're no longer hypnotized by it. You're no longer convinced by it. You're no longer living from it. You're living from something deeper, something truer, something that was here before society told you who to be and will be here after all the performances end. You're living from presence itself, from consciousness itself, from the eternal now that never changes while everything else swirls around it. And maybe that's the greatest gift the disappearing ones offer. They remind us that this is possible, that freedom is possible, that presence is possible, that we don't have to live from fear and lack and endless striving. We can just be, here, now, alive, awake, free. The awakened ones aren't running away from the world. They're returning to reality, and in that return, they're showing the rest of us the way home.